Suspecting her husband of infidelity, a wife hides in his car without her mother-in-law's knowledge to spy on him. And when she discovers what his mistress is hiding, a light, slanting rain drummed against the windows, pulling Natalie from the embrace of a restless sleep. Fragments of night vision still swirled in her head, in which Andrew smiled not at her but at some stranger with chestnut-colored eyes. Natalie winced, pushing away the intrusive and extremely unpleasant images that had haunted her for 2 weeks. A woman dressed in an expensive evening gown. Light hair cascaded down her shoulders like gold. Her full lips expressed sensuality and some unspoken longing. Despite the dream, Natalie didn't want to start her day with such thoughts, especially since today was her and Andrew's wedding anniversary. "Good morning," he whispered, kissing her on the forehead. "Did you sleep well?" "Good," Natalie replied, trying to keep her voice steady as usual. Inside, however, she felt a tightening dread of something bad looming. Recently, Andrew had become distant, somehow cold. He often stayed late at work in the evenings, and on weekends, he spent time in the garage, tinkering with a new minibus. His pride, as he called it, the transportation service. Transportation service, Natalie thought bitterly to herself, oh yes, of course. It sounded too pompous for a couple of runs a week, which, according to Andrew, he made. And each time, without a single phone call, without warning, he just disappeared for hours and then returned smelling of someone else's perfume with a mysterious smile on his lips. According to Andrew, he needed the minibus for business and to expand his transportation area. But Natalie didn't believe it. She had seen him sometimes sneakily jotting down addresses and phone numbers at night. She had heard him whisper unfamiliar names when he thought she was asleep. In turn, her mother-in-law, Emily, always tried to support her beloved son. She noticed nothing. Or pretended to notice nothing. "Natalie, don't worry so much. Andrew is a businessman, and he may have his own affairs. And men, you know, don't always share their concerns with loved ones," Emily would say, patronizingly placing her hand on her daughter-in-law's shoulder. "You need to be a wise wife, create comfort for him, and not interfere." But how could she be wise when her soul was torn apart by jealousy and uncertainty? Natalie felt that something was wrong. The sensation of betrayal crept up on her gradually, like a snake wrapping its cold, slippery body around her. At first, just a slight curiosity, then suspicion, and eventually fear of the unknown. Of course, Natalie had tried to talk to her husband a few times, but he just waved her off, saying she thought too much and was trying to find problems where there were none. "Have you ever thought that maybe I'm just tired?" Andrew asked one day, frowning irritably. "Or are you just bored?" "I feel like you're distancing yourself from me, hiding something," Natalie whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Stop it," her husband embraced her, but his embrace was cold, like ice. "Maybe it's because I lost the baby again? But am I to blame for that?" The thought crossed her mind, triggering a slight migraine. Natalie's jealousy, as well as her suspicion, was fueled not only by his strange behavior but also by little things that, as is known, ruin unfortunate lovers of extramarital affairs. The lipstick stain on Andrew's shirt, which had never been there before, the text message he hastily deleted from his phone screen, and that scent, as if from another woman, with a hint of vanilla. Natalie felt suffocated in this atmosphere of misunderstanding and lies. Her intuition, which had never failed her, screamed that something was wrong. Inside, everything tightened into a hard knot. "Andrew, are you going anywhere in the minibus today? What do you think? Maybe we could go out tonight, to a restaurant," she asked casually during breakfast. "I'm afraid not, dear," her husband replied, not looking up from his reading. "I have a lot of orders today. I need to urgently deliver cargo to another city." "When will you be back?" "In the evening, although probably closer tonight." "Don't worry, everything will be fine." "Fine?" Inside, Natalie felt a chill. She realized she couldn't sit and wait any longer. She needed to know the truth. The thought of possible infidelity had been haunting her for days. The more Natalie tried to push it away, the more insistent it returned, and her inner sense screamed that something was off with Andrew. Therefore, Natalie had long concluded that she needed to see for herself what her husband was really doing in his new car. She spent the entire morning and the first half of the day in anxious anticipation, literally burning with curiosity and fear. She replayed various scenarios in her head, each worse than the last. Her husband's words confirmed her saddest fears. She knew perfectly well that this cargo was not just goods, the transportation was merely a pretext. Andrew was clearly lying to her. "Well, kids, keep your secrets, I have things to do," her mother-in-law said as she headed for the door. Natalie nodded, catching herself thinking that such a chance might not come again. Soon, her husband began getting ready for work, behaving so casually that Natalie immediately understood Andrew had completely forgotten their anniversary. When her husband finally left the house, throwing on his favorite black jacket, Natalie took a deep breath and resolved to do what she had been secretly contemplating for several evenings and nights. "I must find out the truth, come what may, now or never," flashed through her mind. For a while, she silently watched as Andrew stepped outside and headed for his new car. The minibus was large, dark blue, with a shiny body, seeming like a true giant against the backdrop of their cozy home. Then Natalie quickly got up, grabbed a light coat from the hanger, and slipped out of the house through the old doors leading to the backyard. While Andrew lifted the hood and tinkered with the car, Natalie, like a shadow, quietly slipped into the cabin, hiding behind the back seats. Soon Andrew returned, sat behind the wheel, and started the engine. Natalie held her breath, pressing herself against the seat. "Well, ready to go," he said to himself, pressing the gas pedal. The minibus smoothly pulled away. Natalie realized that she was about to observe her husband's behavior for an unknown length of time. Andrew turned on the radio. Soft music played, but Natalie hardly heard it. All her attention was completely absorbed by her husband. She held still. Thoughts tangled, and fear mixed with despair. Natalie felt like a spy invading someone's privacy, but she saw no other way out for herself. At least half an hour passed, which felt like an eternity to her. Andrew glanced at the rearview mirror from time to time. He seemed unaware that anyone else was in the car with him. What is he planning to do next? Natalie thought, feeling her hands begin to tremble with excitement. At that moment, Andrew turned off the music, and Natalie heard him start to speak rapidly on the phone. "Hi, Teresa." "Yes, I'm almost there," her husband said into the phone. Natalie immediately decided he was talking to that very stranger from her dreams. "Yes, almost there. Wait for me." Natalie froze. She tried to catch any phrases that might shed light on his behavior and once again attempted to see something in the dimness of the cabin, but saw nothing. Fear gripped her. "Yes, I'll be glad to see you too." "Okay, I have to go, I'm busy," Andrew replied a bit nervously and hung up. Natalie shuddered. She realized her suspicions were correct. Andrew was cheating on her, and with some girl named Teresa. The road stretched endlessly, and her husband remained silent, intently looking at the wet asphalt. Natalie peeked out from behind the seat and noticed he had turned off the main road. They drove for a while down a narrow asphalt path leading to a small, unremarkable cottage settlement. Her heart tightened painfully. What is Andrew doing here? She tried to make out the faces of people passing by. Many smiled at Andrew, and he reciprocated. Finally, the car stopped in front of one of the cottages. The two-story house was bright, with a neat lawn and large windows. Natalie's heart raced wildly as she peered through the narrow gap in the curtain. Meanwhile, Andrew jumped out of the car and approached the fence of the luxurious cottage. She could see him press the intercom button, and then the gate slowly opened. She flinched when she saw a female figure in the window. Dark hair, slim, could it be Teresa? But to her surprise, two young men in black suits emerged from the cottage, guiding an elderly man in glasses by the arm. The strangers wore expressions of fatigue and indifference. Seeing them, Andrew hurried to meet them. What kind of show is this? Natalie thought. Who are these people? And why does Andrew look so scared? Hey, one of the men continued, pulling Andrew aside so the old man wouldn't hear. I hope you understand that your life depends on this. God forbid something goes wrong. Mr. Mason will slice you to bits. I got it. Andrew nodded nervously. Don't worry, I'll do everything quickly and neatly. Natalie felt like she still didn't understand something important. Everything seemed like some kind of strange operation. Who are they? Flashed through her mind. He looks just like a secret agent from a spy thriller. Andrew addressed the strangers with a sense of urgency and subservience in his voice. Sorry for making you wait. I have everything prepared. We can go. Good, one of them replied. Time's ticking. Let's wrap this up quickly. Natalie tensed. Their words sounded strange. It seemed the men were planning to transport something or someone. Let's go, the cabin is ready, Andrew said, turning toward the minibus. The strangers followed him, and Natalie couldn't believe what was happening. The cottage she had taken for the mistress's hideaway was not what she had expected at all. The elderly man they were guiding was weak and trembling like a wheat stalk in the wind. His eyes appeared dull and devoid of life. He clutched a worn blanket and a small homemade shopping bag. Come on, James, how long are you going to lounge around here? We've got a little house for you by the river, and it's too early for a retirement home, one of the men in black said. Health, oh ho, said another. Thank you, son. But where are the documents for the house? I signed over my apartment in the city to you. I'd like to feel my property in my hands now, the elderly man whispered quietly. Andrew looked anxiously at the mysterious pair. Don't worry, James. Everything will be fine. We left the documents on the kitchen table in the house. As soon as you step inside, you'll find them, the burly man replied immediately. With some sixth sense, Natalie realized he was lying. Not just lying, but doing so boldly and without fear of consequences. Nevertheless, the elderly man nodded in agreement, then was seized by a fit of severe coughing. What's going on here? Is this some kind of home for the elderly? But why are these goons moving him secretly? And why is Andrew speaking in such a syrupy voice? He's a businessman, isn't he? Or not? What's going on? Natalie whispered. In the next moment, it became clear that something was wrong with this house. Andrew opened the car door and then, along with the men, literally dragged the elderly man into the cabin. To Natalie's great relief, James took a seat in the front, not even glancing toward the back of the cabin where she was hiding. At that moment, a beautiful woman with luxurious blonde hair, a slender figure, and expressive eyes emerged from the cottage. Natalie immediately recognized her. The infamous Teresa, who else could it be? The stranger from her dream. There she is, the cause of all my troubles, Natalie thought, gritting her teeth. The traitor who ruined my life. Teresa approached the car and, without hesitation, kissed Andrew. The kiss was long and quite passionate. Andrew embraced her as if he had forgotten everything in the world. Natalie felt her heart break with pain. Thank you, darling, Teresa whispered. You're the best. My father is pleased with you. He says this time your share will be significantly higher. The old man's apartment is worth several million, right in the city center. The notary has everything prepared, so there's nothing to nitpick. No one will find a flaw. Always at your service, Andrew replied, his voice sounding a bit hoarse. Please, be careful, Teresa added, stroking Andrew's cheek. The old man is just that, an old man, but he can put up a fight. You shouldn't have refused the sleeping pills. They might have come in handy, you could have wrapped him in a carpet and been done with it. Which route are you taking today? The first or the second? The second, of course. How long can I keep driving out to this backwater? Let today's dump help, Andrew replied, and as he looked into Teresa's eyes, he started the engine. At that moment, one of the men in a suit abruptly opened the door and sat beside him. "It'll be safer this way, brother." "Too much is at stake," the burly man said with a smile. "Robert, are you bored, or do you want to dodge work at the Mercy home?" Teresa remarked, dissatisfied. The man in black smirked. "Don't worry, Teresa, this is for the best. There are plenty of people to work at the shelter without me. Besides, I was hired as a guard, not a caretaker. Just tell your father that." Teresa reluctantly nodded and waved goodbye. Natalie swallowed hard. How she wanted to grab that beauty by the hair right then and there. And also give Andrew a resounding slap. Let him know she wasn't some simpleton he could deceive at his whim. Naturally, Natalie didn't do that. She felt in her heart that her husband's secret acquaintances were very dangerous. Just that pair in suits was enough to send chills down her spine. Her heart raced wildly. Natalie huddled at the back of the cabin, trying to breathe as quietly as possible to avoid revealing her presence. The smell of cheap air freshener mixed with dust and gasoline filled the cramped space. The fabric of the seats, worn and scorched in places, scratched at her. Natalie felt like a trapped animal about to be discovered. She couldn't believe her eyes and ears. All those weeks and months filled with doubts and suspicions finally gained a terrifying clarity. Andrew, her once loving and caring husband, turned out to be a dark horse hiding a monstrous secret beneath the mask of a respectable businessman. It had all started with small, barely noticeable details: late returns from work, mysterious phone calls that Andrew hastily ended as soon as she appeared in sight, and then strange documents found in his briefcase. Phrases he muttered in his sleep that Natalie, of course, had tried to interpret in a completely different light. She had never considered Andrew a wealthy man, even though he provided her and Emily with a modest but cozy life. But recently, their financial situation had changed. A new car appeared, along with expensive furniture they had never even dreamed of. Deep down, Natalie couldn't understand how all this had happened. How could her loving husband become involved in such a dark story? Andrew had always seemed honest, open, and ready to help anyone in need. But now, looking at his furrowed, focused face, she saw a completely different person. A stranger. A frightening one. Just like the hulking guard Robert, who sat to his right, mentally counting the money from the sale of James's apartment. In that moment, it became clear to Natalie that Andrew was involved in illegal activities, apparently with the participation of his mistress and her father, Mr. Mason. He was taking property from lonely elderly people and then sending them into the unknown. By Route 1 to some remote area. Or by Route 2 to the city dump. The minibus drove out of town on broken, overgrown roads. Natalie pressed against the seats, trying not to breathe and not make a sound. She was terrified. But curiosity and impatience were stronger. "James, are you ready?" Andrew asked, turning to the elderly man sitting behind him. "What do you mean, am I ready?" "Where are you taking me?" the old man asked anxiously. "To a permanent residence where you'll be taken care of," the guard replied for Andrew, showing no emotion. James noticeably tensed, as if sensing what awaited him. Tears sparkled in Natalie's eyes. Sweat rolled down Andrew's face. Sitting next to the killer Robert, he felt uncomfortable. To ease the tension, he turned on the radio again. "Oh, this is a good one. Should have played this sooner. Turn it up, brother," Robert said approvingly. At the same time, a lively melody from some street performer filled the cabin. Then, when the minibus hit another pothole, James suddenly looked around and almost immediately spotted Natalie hiding in the far corner. The old man opened his mouth to speak, but Natalie shook her head negatively. "Be quiet," Natalie pleaded, pressing a finger to her lips. "You can't talk. Save yourself." But James wasn't easily frightened. "You need to know," he muttered, "this Oscar Mason and his daughter Teresa are real criminals. They take our homes from us. And those guards, that driver Andrew, they're all in on it." "What do you mean?" Natalie whispered, realizing she was getting involved in something serious. Mr. Mason promises us good care, comfortable conditions, and then he takes us to the dump or the woods. Meanwhile, he and his cronies take our apartments. Notarized wills or gifts, all above board, and then they get rid of us old folks, James whispered. Natalie gasped. Her breath caught in her throat. She was scared, but at the same time, she felt a rush of adrenaline. She still couldn't believe her beloved husband was capable of such vile deeds. What about the local authorities? Natalie asked, still whispering. Mason paid them off, James replied with a bitter smile, so they help him. A sense of unease washed over her. What should she do next? How could she help the poor old man and other elderly people who might have fallen victim to her husband and his mistress's scheme? We need to run, James whispered, understanding her state of mind. As soon as we arrive, when he offers for me to get out, you run too. Otherwise, you won't be safe. What's your name, anyway? Natalie went pale. So there it was, running away from her own husband. Where had this ever happened? Okay, let's take the risk, she finally whispered and nodded, giving her name. Frankly, Natalie was in shock that she had to keep herself together despite everything. Meanwhile, outside the window, the autumn evening was slowly taking hold. In October, it gets dark quite early, unlike in June. The minibus continued on, and Natalie watched the changing landscapes outside. Abandoned fields, then an empty lot she had never seen before. Natalie held her breath. She realized it was time to act. Suddenly, a pile of garbage appeared out of the darkness. She gasped. It was the city dump, a huge, endless place filled with waste and rotting remains. The smell of decay hit her nostrils, making it hard to breathe. The minibus stopped next to a heap of construction debris. Natalie saw an endless expanse of the dump stretching for many hectares in front of her. The dirty, suffocating air felt oppressive. Rubbish piles, torn bags, broken furniture, old cars, mountains of shattered glass, everything was literally everywhere. Flocks of crows circled over this chaos, letting out piercing cries. Well, Grandpa, shall we take a stroll? Andrew smirked as he got out of the car, deciding to unlock the back door. Fresh air will do you good. What are you doing? James trembled all over. Let me go. Do you hear what you're planning? Don't worry, old man, we're just going to show you a beautiful view of the city, Robert rumbled mockingly. Enjoy the sunset to your heart's content. At that moment, Natalie finally pulled herself together and jumped out of the car, diverting her husband's astonished attention. James, let's run, let's go. James didn't need to be told twice, and he immediately followed her out. The old man moved noticeably faster than when he had gotten into the car, leading Natalie to conclude that he had deliberately misled everyone. Natalie and James dashed away, leaping over heaps of garbage, avoiding sharp objects, and making their way through the thickets of weeds. Natalie! Andrew exclaimed, spotting his wife's familiar profile among the heaps of garbage. What are you doing here? I know everything now, she said in a low voice, and I won't let you destroy people. You still won't be able to stop us. If you want to live, you'd better keep your mouth shut, her husband growled. So this is what? Your woman? Have you lost your mind? Why did you bring her along? Robert exclaimed defiantly. Andrew darkened and lowered his head. At one point, Natalie stumbled into a pothole and fell flat on the garbage-covered ground. Smiles appeared on the pursuers' faces. Don't touch her, you bastards! James shouted, stepping between Natalie and Andrew. So that's how it is. Well, Andrew said, let's see, old man, who's who? Robert, hold them. Anger and cruelty flashed in the guard's eyes. Natalie and James felt despair. They found themselves trapped in a sand dune of garbage, surrounded on three sides. At that moment, they looked around and, to their astonishment, noticed a group of vagabonds living in the dump, dirty and ragged men and women of indeterminate age. "Hey you," shouted one of the homeless, addressing the pursuers. "What do you want here?" "That's none of your business," Andrew replied. "Go back where you came from." "It is our business," answered a tall young vagabond. "We won't let you bully the weak here. Get out of here, your laws don't apply here." "Are you kidding? Aren't you afraid of getting smacked?" Andrew seethed with indignation. At that moment, one of the vagabonds threw a piece of rusty metal at him. Robert tensed, regretting that he hadn't brought a trauma weapon with him. Or at least a baton. But who knew it would come to this? "You won't get away now," the beggar said. "We'll protect them." In a second, at their leader's command, the vagabonds lunged at Andrew and Robert. To be honest, the men were not prepared for this turn of events. They tried to defend themselves, but the homeless were much angrier and stronger than they were. "Run!" Natalie shouted to James, grabbing his hand. Andrew and Robert quickly realized they needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Understanding the futility of their actions, they dashed toward the minibus as the vagabonds began to push them back. However, Natalie and the exhausted James couldn't get far. Soon the vagabonds caught up with them and surrounded them. Then, from the group, the same homeless man who had chased Andrew and his accomplice stepped forward. "Who are you?" Natalie asked timidly. "My name is Steve," he smiled. "I'm here to establish laws and order, so to speak." "Thank you," she said, looking at her savior with gratitude. "No need to thank me," he replied. "I've never been able to stand by and watch people get hurt since childhood. Come with us. You can rest a bit and catch your breath." James readily agreed. Natalie didn't resist either. Why hurt kind people with a refusal? A few minutes later, Steve led the guests to his hut, built from scraps of old boards and metal. Inside, it was cramped and stuffy, but clean. Old posters cut from magazines and photographs hung on the walls. An oil lamp stood on the table, and in one corner, a small hearth smoldered with a pot over it. "Come in," Steve said, giving up his spot on the only bench. "Don't be afraid, it's safe here." Despite the cold and dampness outside the shack and the stench of rotting waste that seemed suffocating, Natalie felt that this place had become an oasis of safety for her. "You can even stay with us for a while," Steve said. "No one will bother you here anymore." Natalie tiredly sank onto a piece of wooden board that Steve brought for her. She looked at James, who was inwardly grateful for the life-saving intervention, and realized that she had entered a completely different world with its own laws and order. A world where there was hope and where it could thrive even in the most unfavorable conditions. Soon, 2 sooty aluminum mugs filled with strong tea and a package of sweet pastries from the store ended up in the hands of James and Natalie. "Thank you," Natalie said, looking at the host. "For everything." "No need to thank me," Steve replied. "I just help those in need." Natalie looked into the young vagabond's eyes and saw not rudeness but sincerity, not anger but compassion. She also realized that true heroes could be born in the most unexpected places, even in a dump. "You know," Steve began, gazing at the fire, "this is our trash heap. It's a reflection of our world. Everything we throw away, everything we consider unnecessary, ends up here. And people. Sometimes people also become unwanted trash." "How did you end up here?" Natalie asked, feeling much calmer in this unfamiliar place. "Oh, that's a long story," Steve replied, smiling sadly. "I lost my family, my home, then the streets. Yes, life can be unfair. But I learned to live here, learned to find beauty in this seemingly hopeless place. And I learned to help those who are weaker." "Yes, you are strong," Natalie whispered, not noticing how her voice trembled. "Strong?" Steve scoffed. "Strength isn't in muscles, strength is in spirit. It's the ability not to give up and not lose heart, no matter what. Like our people," he nodded toward the hut, "many of them have been through a lot. But they still survive and help each other. That's what matters." "I support that," James's grandfather chimed in. Natalie smiled and looked at the old man she had saved with tenderness. After all, it hadn't been in vain. The surveillance and the exposure of Andrew and his mistress's activities had been worthwhile. At that moment, Steve decided to share his story with his guests. "I was an ambulance driver," he began with a slight rasp in his voice. "I saved lives, helped people, and then," he paused, struggling to swallow the painful lump in his throat. Then, this call happened. A night, rain, a terrible storm. I arrived, his voice trembled. And there, in the cradle, wrapped in an old blanket, lay a tiny, completely defenseless baby, and no one was around. No notes, nothing, just a child in a portable basket. The former driver fell silent, reliving the moment. Of course, I took him to the hospital. The doctors started guessing what to do next. I thought, and it struck me. Kate, she always wanted children. We tried, but it never worked out. And I decided this was a sign. We had to help this baby. Steve lifted his eyes to them, filled with a plea for understanding. I came home and told her everything. At first, Kate was overjoyed. She said, "Yes, we'll take him, we'll have our family." And I was on cloud nine with happiness. And what happened next? Natalie asked quietly, almost in a whisper. Then, Steve smiled bitterly, his lips twisting in a grimace of pain. Then Kate just left me for another man. She packed her things, saying she couldn't do it anymore. She wasn't ready for such responsibility. For a child she hadn't given birth to. She said it was too much of a burden. She disappeared, as if we had never shared a life together. I went insane from the pain and anger, trying to understand why. I argued, I fought. I tried to resolve things. In the end, I lost everything. My job, my apartment, my sense of life. Natalie listened without interrupting. Her heart ached with empathy as she imagined the despair of this man who had lost everything he loved. I started drinking, the vagabond continued, the alcohol numbed the pain, but only for a little while. Then I found myself here, at the dump, and it felt like I had turned into trash, into nothingness that no one wants to notice. He fell silent, and the creases on his forehead deepened, as if emphasizing the weight of his past. Natalie and James didn't utter a word, completely immersed in the tragedy of this man. And sometimes I see her, Steve suddenly whispered. My wife. She drives up in her new car. So happy, carefree, while his voice cracked. I live at rock bottom. Natalie felt in his words not just the pain of loss, but also an overwhelming longing for the past. Steve was literally enslaved by memories of the time when his life was filled with love and meaning. How can this be? She asked. You were so happy, you saved so many lives, doesn't any of it mean anything? Steve shook his head. It's just a job. And when the person closest to you leaves and your whole world falls apart, no number of lives saved matters. Natalie didn't know what to say. She understood that Steve's losses had burned something irreplaceable in his soul. Yet she still hoped that somewhere deep in his heart, a spark of hope still flickered. After pouring out his heart, the homeless man fell silent, and his shoulders slumped helplessly. And what about the baby? Natalie whispered, feeling tears welling in her eyes. She couldn't imagine how someone could be so callous and soulless as to abandon a defenseless infant. Michael. I named him Michael. He's still in the orphanage, where I visit him and help as much as I can, but it's not the same. It's not what I dreamed of, Steve said, gazing at the sunset sky with painful longing. A silence filled with sorrow and despair settled in. Natalie felt a wave of sadness rising within her. She imagined little Michael, left to fend for himself, and her heart ached with pain. James seemed to be affected by Steve's story much more deeply than Natalie. His eyes dimmed, becoming deep and sorrowful. You're not alone, Natalie said, her voice soft and soothing. James and I now know your story. Your actions are admirable. You wanted to help, dreamed of starting a family, and you continue to care for Michael. That means a lot. Yes, James chimed in, people like you, Steve, are rare in our time. Despite all the hardships, you haven't become bitter or broken. On the contrary, you've preserved kindness and compassion within you. Well, what do I do now? Steve asked, looking at his guests with a hint of hope, barely noticeable but still there. How do I return to a normal life? You're strong, Steve, Natalie said. You just need to find the strength to start over. Think about it. Maybe you can find a job at another ambulance service, maybe even in another city. Or, if you have the desire and the energy, you could get an education. There's always a chance in life. And what about Michael? Steve interrupted. I can't just leave him. Of course, don't leave him, Natalie replied. Keep visiting him and helping him. Maybe someday Michael will grow up and realize you were a true friend to him, and he'll be grateful to you. Tears shimmered in Steve's eyes. Thank you for your support and concern. Now, it seems like I can see the light at the end of the tunnel again. James embraced the vagabond around the shoulders and pulled him close. You're a good man, Steve. I know what I'm talking about. I've devoted 40 years to teaching. Natalie raised her eyebrows in surprise. So you used to be a teacher? James smiled. Yes, dear, I worked. I taught mathematics. I always considered myself smart and prudent, but I raised other people's children while I couldn't raise my own son, Justin, the old man said, tears welling in his eyes. Natalie looked anxiously at the kind teacher, fearing he might fall ill. Justin went down the wrong path. I tried to provide him with everything he needed from a young age. I worked hard to earn a higher salary. In my free time, I tutored and took extra hours at school. But he seemed to have relaxed on everything handed to him. After finishing school, he got involved with a bad crowd. At first, it was cards, girls, all the usual stuff. Then, when he ran out of money, he turned to robbery. They couldn't catch him for a long time. But no matter how long a rope twists, it will eventually come to an end. Anyway, not long before his arrest, he came to us with my wife, his head down, and asked for forgiveness for being such a wayward son. He apologized and left, going wherever his eyes took him. 2 days later, he ran into a police sting operation. Naturally, he resisted. He had been carrying a weapon for a long time. In short, Justin died during the arrest. That's how it is. My wife, Anna, didn't survive him for long. She passed away a month after the funeral. Her heart couldn't take it. For a while, I thought about following my family too. But then I pulled through. I found solace in teaching children. I started teaching again. I offered free lessons at home to anyone in need. Many of my former students now hold good positions and jobs, but I never asked them for help. They probably don't even remember me anymore. But I have an excellent memory, photographic even. I can recall every face, every name, just like I see them now. Natalie looked at her new acquaintance with undisguised respect, having unknowingly saved him from the illegal actions of her husband. Steve listened to James, holding his breath. He hadn't had a great time in school, but he wasn't to blame for it. After all, his stepfather drank heavily, and his mother, working as a cleaner at the school, couldn't provide her son even with the necessities. Many said Steve would become a delinquent or end up in prison. But by the time he reached his senior year, the boy suddenly got his act together, got his driver's license, served in the army, and after being discharged, went to work as an ambulance driver. My teachers were right. Nothing good would come of me. I guess I'll just live my life as a vagabond. Although I have no one to blame. What's written in your fate is, as they say, Steve lamented, tossing more wood into the dimly glowing stove. James shook his head. No, Steve, you're wrong about that. A person is the master of their own happiness. Only they choose how to live their life going forward. Of course, don't think I'm judging you. Your way of life doesn't shock me. The main thing is that a person remains a human being. Everything else is trivial. I, for example, am a respected teacher. But what good is that? I trusted con artists. I thought I would spend my remaining years in a private mercy home among my, so to speak, peers in age. But look how it turned out. Oscar Mason turned out to be very cunning. He initiated conversations gently, cautiously probing the elderly. He would find out what property they had and then call a notary, persuading the next resident to transfer everything to him. He always promised housing in exchange, and it would be equivalent, so the value would match exactly. And I was a fool for believing that they would buy me a little house by the river. I have no use for an apartment in the city, but a cozy little house in nature would be perfect, just me, my fishing rod, and a loyal dog by my side. Oh, what more could I ask for? Steve smiled at James's grandfather. The young vagabond's mood noticeably improved, largely because he had met such good people. No, this didn't mean that the dump was inhabited solely by criminals with dark pasts. There were even people here who had once been well-known and quite wealthy, who, one not-so-fine day, faced problems they could no longer solve. Since it was getting late, Steve suggested that James and Natalie get some sleep, while he decided to spend the night outside his little shack, where he planned to light a fire and enjoy the stars. At first, Natalie felt embarrassed, but then she realized she truly had no other choice. After everything she had experienced that day, her legs trembled, and her mind was filled with a terrible chaos of thoughts and memories from the recent past. Not long ago, everything had been fine with her and Andrew. Even her mother-in-law's presence hadn't spoiled their leisure time. It was only after the purchase of that cursed minibus that Natalie finally saw what her husband really was. In collusion with Teresa and her father, Andrew had been exploiting innocent elderly people, hiding behind the guise of a private mercy home. Deep down, Natalie couldn't comprehend how someone could be so cynical and indifferent to the misfortunes of others and the plight of the elderly. It was hard to imagine how many lives Andrew and his crew had shattered, leaving people homeless. To Natalie's surprise, during her conversation with Steve, she learned that he had already saved elderly people twice who had been dropped off at the dump by some people without money or documents. The young vagabond provided them with first aid, then helped them get to the city, where they planned to file a report with the police. However, this led to nothing concrete, as the elderly had no evidence. They had given all their property to Mason entirely voluntarily and in the presence of a qualified lawyer. Lying on a hard cot made of several layers of cardboard, Natalie stared at a spot where the stars peeked through a hole in the roof of the shack. The weaker James had already fallen asleep, quietly snoring and dreaming of rainbows. Natalie smiled, mentally comparing the elderly man to a child who could easily fall asleep almost anywhere he was placed. Unbeknownst to her, Natalie slipped into painful memories that transported her several years into the past. She had met Andrew completely by chance at one of the student parties, where, with the approval of the class president, an impromptu masquerade ball was being held. Everyone present wore masks, and the only way to recognize anyone was by their voice, and only if you had known them before. The young people danced, laughed, and let loose to their heart's content. At some point, Natalie was invited to dance by a tall, broad-shouldered guy with kind brown eyes. She couldn't see his facial features because of the mask, but as she took his hand, she twirled to the sounds of an old-fashioned waltz amid the envious sighs of most of her female classmates. At that moment, Natalie felt as if she were floating on clouds and could conquer any heights. Andrew removed his mask only at the end of the evening, pleasantly surprising her with his appearance. Offering to walk Natalie home, the guy filled the entire journey with interesting stories and countless jokes. Later, at her doorstep, Andrew gathered the courage to kiss Natalie on the cheek, sending a wave of sweet tremors through her body. From that moment on, they began to date. At first, none of their mutual acquaintances thought that Andrew and Natalie could become a couple, as they seemed to have almost nothing in common. Their personalities were notably different, making them seem completely unlike one another. Nevertheless, Andrew got his way, and despite the skeptical remarks from friends, he proposed to Natalie. Naturally, she immediately accepted, as by that time she was utterly and irrevocably in love with him. The only problem was Andrew's future mother-in-law, who took an instant dislike to her son's chosen one from the first moments of their meeting. It couldn't be said that Natalie stood out too much from their family. In essence, they lived quite similarly. Andrew only managed to achieve any significant wealth after a year when, at his wife's suggestion, he decided to start his own business based on freight transportation across various regions. However, Natalie didn't pursue a career, quickly resigning herself to the role of the shadowy advisor who meticulously dealt with her husband's financial problems, always remaining in the background. It was she who helped Andrew stay afloat, keep within the law, and never fall behind on payments. Unfortunately, Natalie never received any gratitude from either Andrew or Emily. Not only did her mother-in-law criticize her every day, but at one point, her husband found a mistress and got involved in a criminal business that brought in much more money than legitimate transportation. While Natalie lay on the cot in Steve's shack, Andrew and Robert, having driven a considerable distance from the dump, contemplated what to do next. Do you even have any idea what will happen to her? When Mr. Mason finds out what happened, Robert asked anxiously. His partner shook his head. I understand, of course, but what can I do? How was I supposed to know that my wife would decide to get in the car and follow me? She's got only one brain cell, the one that holds her ears up, and here she is, figuring it out, Robert grimaced. Well, you know, this is now your problem. Think about what you'll tell the boss. You're having an affair with Teresa, right? Maybe he won't execute the future son-in-law. What do you think? The mocking tone of his companion sparked a flare of anger in Andrew. Why are you picking on me? I love Teresa, and that's that, got it? If you keep poking your nose where it doesn't belong, you'll bitterly regret it. Robert paled and involuntarily reached for his waistband, where he used to keep his weapon. Not finding the plastic grip with his fingers, he was visibly disappointed, recalling that he hadn't brought it today due to his irresponsible attitude toward work. Truth be told, Robert never thought that the frail old man James could put up a decent resistance. But things turned out quite differently. However, if it hadn't been for Natalie, Andrew's wife, everything could have gone smoothly. They could be sitting in the boss's office counting money right now. After thinking for a moment, Robert looked anxiously toward the dump. Listen, but you do realize that Oscar won't forgive us this so easily? And your wife might go to the police if things go south. Andrew was as gloomy as a thundercloud. I don't understand what you're getting at, Robert. Just say it straight. Enough with the games and tricks. What is there to say when everything is already clear? We need to set this dump on fire. Let them all get up from their cozy little spots. Vagabonds or not, I don't care. We'll get our money and scatter for a while until they find a new old man, Robert smirked. At that moment, his partner's suggestion seemed reasonable to Andrew. This year's summer had been quite dry, and autumn was even worse, with hardly a drop of rain. Well, unless you counted this morning's drizzle. What, we could try. Just let's set it on fire from different sides to be sure. Let them see what it's like. To run without looking back, just wherever their eyes take them, Andrew said, starting the engine. At that moment, unsuspecting Steve was sitting outside, admiring the stars, thinking about how his life might have turned out if he had adopted a baby with Kate back then. Fortunately, the vagabond's keen nose caught the scent of smoke approaching from different directions. Jumping up from the old, worn-out chair, he dashed to the shack and yanked the door open. Natalie, James, get up faster. We're burning. There's a fire at the dump. Natalie got up almost immediately. The old man needed a bit more time to stretch his stiff joints and get to his feet. Meanwhile, Steve was already running across the dump like a midnight fury, trying to wake as many of his fellow vagabonds as possible. Soon, gathered in one place, the homeless people, along with their meager belongings and street pets, made their way toward the exit, which Steve believed was still not engulfed in flames. Time was ticking away, but they managed just in time. As soon as the last vagabond left the dump, the fiery trap snapped shut, and the entire area was engulfed in flames. The sound of sirens rang out as several fire units rushed to extinguish the blaze. Meanwhile, Robert and his accomplice had already driven a considerable distance away, rubbing their hands together, thinking they had covered their tracks. But that, of course, was not the case. Right after Steve and his companions escaped the fiery trap, he approached a team of local journalists who had come for another scoop and began quietly recounting what had happened to Natalie and James. Naturally, the perceptive vagabond quickly realized that something was amiss in this situation. The dump had never burned so fiercely on its own, especially not from multiple sides at once. Steve quickly put two and two together and understood that those who had been chasing James's grandfather and Natalie were likely involved in the arson. At first, the reporters dismissed the young vagabond's words as the product of an overactive imagination and listened half-heartedly. But when Natalie and James's accounts confirmed his story, everything fell into place. The journalists passed the necessary information to the police, who, in turn, announced a plan to intercept. Of course, Andrew and Robert knew nothing of this. Unbeknownst to them, they were calmly approaching the cottage settlement where the private mercy home was located. They were stopped just a few meters before the turn into the settlement. The police patrol found it suspicious that a dark-colored minibus was driving around the city at that time, especially after the alarm had been raised. When Robert realized they were being hunted, he couldn't contain himself and jumped out of the moving vehicle. "Come on, Andrew, after me. Move, brother, move. Otherwise, we'll all be caught." Robert shouted, but he didn't manage to run far before being apprehended by traffic police officers. When handcuffs clicked on Andrew's wrists, he understood everything without words and immediately began to testify, eager to sink his colleagues as quickly as possible before they sunk him first. By the following morning, searches and high-profile arrests began at the Mercy home located in the cottage settlement. The former school teacher provided the police with valuable information, precisely describing what had happened while he was under the watch of the attendants in that cursed house. But the prosecution's arguments were not solely based on James's testimony. Steve had also saved several elderly people whom Andrew and his accomplices had left exposed to the elements at the city dump, hoping they would die and not raise suspicions from law enforcement. Oscar Mason and Teresa were arrested a little later at the airport, where they were trying to buy a ticket for a flight to the capital of a Western European country. Teresa did not deny anything and immediately laid everything out as it was, thereby depriving her father of the chance to resist the investigators' arguments. From that day on, Natalie and Steve became true heroes, and they appeared in several editions of local and regional news. The story was so shocking that no one could believe that right under the noses of city authorities, Oscar Mason was engaged in schemes, taking away housing from innocent elderly citizens. Naturally, after the exposure of the group of con artists, all the apartments were returned to their rightful owners, and James returned to the city. Thanks to Steve's brave actions in saving homeless people from the burning dump, the mayor offered him a job at one of the volunteer centers, where he could, just like before, take care of his fellow street dwellers. Steve accepted the offer almost immediately, understanding that such an opportunity comes only once in a lifetime. In turn, Emily repeatedly urged her daughter-in-law to withdraw her police statement and help exonerate Andrew with her testimony. But Natalie did not succumb to her mother-in-law's pleas, and instead of offering help, she filed for divorce, a decision she had been contemplating for the past few weeks. Later, Natalie built her life with Steve, who achieved good results in the volunteer fund after leading the regional network for helping the homeless. But the most important thing was not even that. It was that Steve eventually adopted Michael from the orphanage, who had been eagerly waiting for his adoptive father and had come to see him as his closest family. "Thank you. Are you going to give me a little brother or a sister? I heard they find children in cabbage, so we could definitely use a garden," the little boy declared authoritatively on the way home. Steve glanced at Natalie, and they both burst out laughing. Michael initially pouted but then joined his parents, bringing joy to the passers-by who saw a happy family before them.